Welcome to Walking with Conviction in an Anxious Age. I'm Pastor Chris Miller. The world is unsettled, but that doesn't mean you have to be. This podcast is for people who want to walk calmly and confidently with Jesus in uncertain times. I'm not here to tell you what to think or what to do. You make your own decisions. My aim is simple: to help you walk with Christ in a way that cultivates Christ-like character through clear thinking, intentional living, and confidence formed by conviction. We'll talk about scripture, culture, faith, and everyday obedience. And together, we'll learn to walk faithfully with Jesus day in and day out. We're walking this road together, faithful, grounded, and free.
Did you know the average adult English speaker typically uses about 5 to 10,000 words actively? Those are words we use every day. Interesting thing, we understand far more words than that, somewhere between 20,000 and 35,000 words. So most of us understand almost twice as many words as we actually use. And because of that, we tend to prefer language that's simple and familiar. And I read somewhere, I don't know how accurate it is. You read all kinds of things, but the more complicated our speech is, the less intelligent people think we are. So when we try to sound smart, it actually counteracts our goal. Interesting thought. And when we're hurting or confused or even just listening, maybe to a podcast, our usable vocabulary, it doesn't expand, it actually shrinks, which means that if we want to communicate clearly, especially about something like suffering, which we've been talking about for the past few weeks, we need to aim for simple, concrete language rather than trying to be clever or abstract. And one of the things I've learned speaking over the years is that if I don't understand what I'm talking about, no one else is going to either. That's for sure. And I've also learned that simplicity is engaging for people, and complexity puts people to sleep. Speaking of simplicity, do you remember Coco the gorilla? You might remember the picture of her holding a kitten. I think it was floating around the internet for a while. Coco could sign about 1,000 words and understand around 2,000 spoken English words, which is about the level of a 2 to 3-year-old kid. Apparently, that's pretty good for a gorilla. And there's some debate about how much of that was actual communication and how much was just a trained response. But there was one way in particular that Coco never used her vocabulary, something she never did. She never asked a question. And asking questions is uniquely human. We don't just use words, we ask questions. We try to make sense of things. And, if you've ever been around a kid who is getting old enough to start making sense of the world and figure things out, they are full of questions. And they're curious, they want to learn, and they ask relentlessly. I think of sometimes a little kid's favorite word is why, why. As we grow older, we tend to become less curious, I suppose, just because we know the answer to a lot of those questions. But we ask fewer questions, and we become more settled in our experience and our beliefs. We become more and more certain about what we know, or at least what we think we know. And because of that, there are times when we enter a situation and make a very brief analysis of things and then make an assumption based on our experience and our beliefs. And we do that all the time. We do it so quickly that often we don't even think about it. We look at someone or something that's happening and make an assumption about what's happening and what's going on and why it's happening. Sometimes we don't even realize we're doing it. Text messages are a great example of that. We send someone a text message, depending on how they reply or maybe don't reply, we tend to make assumptions. And with text is difficult to communicate because there's no voice inflection, there's no body language. Makes it hard to interpret sometimes. Or if we're, going to church, for example, and someone we normally speak to or say hello to, or they say hello to us, walks by without saying anything, we tend to assume something. Maybe we think, oh, well, they must be angry at me, or maybe they're busy or their mind's on something, whatever. When we make assumptions, sometimes we're right, but we often make false assumptions. We don't really know, but we make an assumption, then we act on it like it's true. And assumptions often create a feeling in us, and then we act and speak based on that assumption or feeling. And as we get older, unlike a little kid, we skip the curiosity questions and learning and just assume things. And like so many other things, that's not always bad. It's useful at times. We don't always have time to figure everything out and ask a bunch of questions. Um, but it can be bad, especially when it comes to suffering. And what we've been doing with our time in the book of Job is dismantling some common false assumptions about suffering. And one of them is the false assumption that righteous behavior is a shield against suffering. We talked about that the first week and learned that it's just not. Job is suffering, but he didn't do anything that caused his suffering. Bible said he was upright and blameless. Even God said that, but he was still suffering. Jesus, perfectly righteous, and he suffered greatly. God often uses suffering to form us. We've also discussed some of the assumptions people make about God's character and questions like why do good things happen to bad people, or why do bad things happen to good people, however it's phrased, or excuse me, not really questions about suffering. I suppose they are sometimes, but they're most so assumptions about God's character, and who God is and what he's like. But the reality is that human suffering doesn't define his character, neither do our assumptions about him. And it's good to be curious, great to ask questions, learn. We can't realistically slow down and do that all the time because unlike most kids, we have jobs and life and we just don't have time. So we take our experience, our beliefs, and we make assumptions. And we often treat those as certain without even really realizing that our assumption might not be true. And then those assumptions shape the way we speak and the things we do. And sometimes we act on those with certainty. Words spoken with certainty based on false assumptions can wound people and even destroy relationships. So we need to be careful about that. Someone can make an assumption based on something as simple as, another person walking by without saying hello, and make an assumption about it, take it, run with it, let it shape words and wound that person who simply had a lot on their mind when they walked by. Sometimes when our assumptions are strong enough and they become mingled with pride, we can even fight against what's true when we've made a false assumption. Wrong assumptions fuel words that wound people. And we can make false assumptions about God that become words that hurt people. And that's the violence of bad theology. And that's what we're talking about today. The title of our podcast is The Violence of Bad Theology. Wounding people with bad theology happens when we make assumptions before curiosity, questions, and learning, even well-intentioned assumptions. And we find Job and his friends in a similar situation this week. And we'll pick up where we left off last week. Well, we'll start in Job chapter 2. We'll be bounced around a bit, but we'll start in chapter 2, and we're going to read verses 11 through 13. This is what they say. 3 friends of Job heard about all this evil that had come upon him, and each one came from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They had agreed together to come to mourn with him and to comfort him. They saw him from a distance and did not recognize him, so they wept aloud. Each one tore his robe, and they tossed dust into the air above their heads. They sat down with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. Meanwhile, no one was speaking to him at all because they saw his pain was severe. So Job's friends, they hear everything that's happened to him and they come to mourn with him and comfort him. When they saw him, he was in such bad shape they didn't even recognize him. And they joined him in mourning for 7 days and 7 nights. And no one spoke because they saw in what a great deal of pain he was in. When Job's friends come, they don't show up to hurt him. They came to help. And this is their best moment. When they sit with Job for 7 days and nights, they do well. But good intentions, unfortunately, don't guarantee good outcomes. And they were the most helpful when they said nothing. But Eliphaz, he is the first of Job's friends to say anything, and he sets the tone for the conversation going forward. And we're going to call him the voice of experience. And when he finally does speak, he sounds calm and reasonable. He's measured in what he says. He speaks well of Job and offers him some encouragement, and he even sounds wise. And in chapter 4, verses 7 and 8, he says, "Remember now who being innocent ever perished, or where were the upright ever wiped out? Just like I have seen those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same." Um, what Eliphaz says sounds wise, and some of what he says is true. You reap what you sow. That's a biblical principle. That is true. And what he's saying to Job is, think about it, Job. When have you ever seen an innocent person suffer like you are right now? In my experience, people reap what they sow. And that sounds reasonable, and that's often true, but it's not always true. We all understand cause and effect. We've seen people suffer the consequences of their actions. We've seen people make, um, yeah, decisions that weren't great and then have bad things happen because of that. And we've all seen and experienced patterns in life. So, Eliphaz isn't just pulling this out of nowhere. He's speaking from experience, and he's making an appeal to Job's experience. And when he says to him, Job, what I've seen, and I know you've seen this too, and I think at least to some degree, he's trying to be nice. He's trying to be helpful. But here's the problem. He he skipped curiosity, he skipped questions, he skipped learning about what was going on with Job, and he assumes that he understands Job's suffering based on his own experience. But his assumption is false. And what he says is based on a false assumption. You reap what you sow. True. However, that's not the case with Job. He's taken his personal experience and turned it into a rule for how God always works. He takes the truth of his own experience and assumes Job's experience is the same. Now, his experience is real and it's true. You reap what you sow, that's obvious. But in Job's case, we know something Eliphaz doesn't. Job, uh, Job is reaping something he didn't sow. He didn't make any decisions that caused what happened to him. And yeah, his suffering is not a result of his actions. He's not suffering because he did something wrong. Everything Eliphaz says is based on a false assumption that Job did do something wrong. Even though what Eliphaz says is true, instead of helping Job carry the weight of his suffering, he analyzes why he's under it. And have you ever done that? I know I have at times. We've probably all done that. But Job's children are dead. He's lost everything. And his friend is basically telling him, well, you reap what you sow. And in Job's case, that's just not true. Now, we may not say it just like that, but we can make assumptions by applying our own experience to someone who has had a different experience than we have. We can say things like, they must have done something to deserve that, or maybe God is trying to get their attention or teach them a lesson, or maybe God is punishing that person. And why do we do that? Well, we do it because we want to make sense of suffering. And if it has a clear cause, if we can explain why it's happening, even if it's only our assumption, then suffering makes sense because it often doesn't. So Eliphaz isn't just trying to help or correct Job, he's trying to make sense of something that doesn't fit his personal experience. And his experience has formed his understanding of God. And if we're honest with ourselves on some level, we've all done that. We've taken our own experience, skipped the curiosity questions, the learning, and made an assumption that we then use to explain someone else's circumstances or even our own. Not because we don't care, but because we don't know what else to do. And here's something we can learn from Eliphaz. Our personal experience is not a standard that God uses for decision making. It's just not. And not everything that has been true in our experience is true in every experience. Even though Eliphaz has experience what he says is true, he tries to apply that to Job as a rule of how God always works. And in this case, even though what he says is true, it's not true in Job's case. And yeah, a pattern is not a promise. When someone's suffering, they don't need an explanation based on assumptions made from our own experience. What they need is our presence. We need to be careful not to assume our experience is someone else's explanation. If Eliphaz is the voice of experience, then Bildad is the voice of tradition or belief. Eliphaz makes assumptions based on experience. Bildad makes assumptions based on what he's always believed. In Job 8:6, he says, "If you were pure and upright, surely now he would rouse himself on your behalf," speaking about God, "and he would prosper your righteous dwelling." In other words, what he's saying is, Job, if you were really right with God, he would fix this. And since he hasn't, the problem must be you. And what Bildad says, it sounds good too. And we know God is just, we know he cares. Bildad isn't just making things up, he's making an assumption based on what is traditionally believed about God. And he does that because he skips the curiosity, the questions, and the learning. And he makes an assumption based on his beliefs about how and when God acts. And he takes truth about God and he basically puts a timeline on it. Eliphaz makes the assumption that God has caused Job's suffering because of something he's done. And Bildad comes from the other direction and assumes that God hasn't ended Job's suffering because of something Job has done. And of course, God is just, but he also isn't subject to our timeline or our assumptions, or time at all for that matter. He doesn't always exercise his justice in a way that looks like we think it should. And I think that's why people sometimes ask, why does God allow evil to continue? Just because we don't see immediate justice brought against evil in the way we think it should be doesn't mean it won't be, or it doesn't mean that God ignores it. It only means things are not happening in the way we assume they should. And same same thing with Bildad. We know something he doesn't. And it's not the case that Job's suffering hasn't ended because Job is doing something wrong or did do something wrong, which means Bildad's assumption, although it sounds right, sounds good, it's still a false assumption. What Bildad does, instead of helping Job carry the weight of his suffering, is question Job's integrity. He's like, well, you say you haven't done anything wrong, but you must be lying because you're in this situation or your suffering hasn't ended yet. And, we've talked about this before. There are problems you solve and tensions you manage. Bildad is uncomfortable with the tension, so he's pushing Job to solve a problem that doesn't exist. Where Eliphaz says if you had your life together, you wouldn't be suffering. Bildad is telling Job if you would get your life together, God would stop your suffering. But they're both wrong. Now, again, what does that sound like when you and I say it? If if you just learn to trust God more, everything would be fine. You just need to have more faith. You just need to believe more. You just need to get closer to the Lord. Or if you were really walking with Jesus, your suffering would end, or this wouldn't be happening. All good things to do. Get closer to the Lord, walk with Jesus, but none of them mean suffering will cease or that a person's behavior caused the suffering or will bring it to an end. Why do we do that? Because if God always responds to changed behavior, if we could control God with our behavior, then life is always predictable and controllable. And that puts us in control, not God. If we think, well, if I do A, B, and C, if I tick these boxes off on the list, I'll avoid suffering. Or if I do A, B, C, my suffering will end. If we could manipulate suffering with behavior, that would put us in control. And we talked about that last week. Really, control is an illusion. We think, God, you have to end my suffering now because I did all this stuff. And we just tend to think that way. We also think that way for other people when they're suffering. And when you or someone else, you know, were facing difficult circumstances, how often have you heard someone say or heard it said, well, you know what you need to do? or you know what I would do if I were you. Those things are terrible to hear when you're suffering. But the thing about that is we don't know what they should do 95% of the time. And we're not that person 100% of the time. We're not like that because we're trying to hurt somebody. A lot of that kind of stuff is well intentioned. Um, we try to do it because we don't know how to be still in tension, how to be comfortable in tension, how to be at peace in uncertainty. We just don't know how to rest in something that makes us uncomfortable and what doesn't make sense. So we try to control it. And we say things like, well, if I were you, the way God does things, when he does things, how he does them are not things we control or we can control or even fully understand. And God not fixing suffering doesn't mean something's wrong. We or someone we know might be exactly where we're supposed to be. And, unchanging circumstances, if you're suffering and it doesn't change, it's not a proof of failure. Eliphaz speaks from experience, Bildad speaks from tradition. And then lastly, we come to Zophar in Job chapter 11. And Zophar, he speaks with certainty. He's not curious, doesn't ask questions, doesn't learn a thing because he already knows. He doesn't even slow down because he's certain and he's going to fix Job because Job is wrong. And he isn't making assumptions from experience or tradition. He just knows exactly what God is doing in his mind. And you can read about what he says in Job chapter 11, but that's pretty lengthy. So I'll sum it up for you, but you can read it on your own. That would be good to do. But he basically says, Job, you talk too much and you're wrong. And if God were to speak to you, he would tell you that you deserve worse than what you are going through now. Can you imagine that, guy? Somebody telling you that when you've lost your family and everything else. He also says God sees everything, he judges rightly, and his wisdom is beyond human understanding. Well, maybe apparently except for Zophar. But he says some things that are true. And then he tells Job, because those things are true about God, that means you are guilty. He makes that assumption. Then he tells Job, put away your sin, return to God, and then he'll fix everything, which is pretty much the same assumption of all Job's friends have made. Zophar uses something true about God to say something untrue about Job. And his assumptions cause him to take right truth and make wrong application. And that is the violence of bad theology. And Zophar is the most confident, and he's also the most damaging. And bad theology doesn't always come from lies or misunderstandings about God. It comes from truth wrongly applied. Zophar's speech shows us something we all need to hear. You can be theologically accurate and still have bad theology because of wrong application. Bad theology misrepresents who God is by making assumptions about who he is. And it wounds people, it hurts people, destroys relationships. It's always destructive when we make wrong assumptions about who God is. And theology is not based on the assumptions we make, it's based on who God is. And the thing is we can be like Zophar and be certain we know that, even though we're actually operating from a false assumption. And you've probably heard about people who have been hurt by churches. Maybe you're one of them. I've spoken to several, chatted with some people online, things like that. And to be fair in that, some of that is not really legitimate. Sometimes, somebody said something mean to somebody and they call it church hurt. And it's not really that. But some of it is legitimate. When we make false assumptions about God and then speak and act on his behalf, it hurts people, it wounds people. And bad theology often claims to speak for God. When we act on his behalf, which we shouldn't be doing anyway, and on top of that, we do it based on a false assumption, that's always going to do damage. That's never going to go well. It's never going to be a good thing. And Zophar assumes something no one on the earthly side of things knows. He assumes that Job has hidden guilt. He's like, it's obviously the case, and he's certain about it. He speaks as if that assumption is fact, and he speaks with confidence. When someone does that, they often use religious, moral language. They sound like they're defending God, and they do it boldly. They do it with gusto. But boldness is not the same as truth. And confidence doesn't equal correctness. Although confidence and boldness can get you through a lot, but it doesn't make you right. And he speaks with certainty about what only God knows. So instead of helping Job, he condemns him. Instead of helping him up, he actually pushes him down. And think about all Job has lost. He's barely holding on. And Zophar tells him he deserves worse than what he's getting. And that's pretty rough. That's pretty damaging. And we may not say it that bluntly, but we can be just as certain about a false assumption. God is punishing you or God is punishing that person. I know exactly why this is happening, or God is clearly doing this for this reason, or because. We say things like that because certainty feels like control. And we want to be in control. It's difficult for us to learn to be comfortable, learn to be at peace in uncertainty and suffering. And if I can confidently explain it, if I can confidently explain the why of suffering, then I don't have to deal with the tension of uncertainty. And Zophar is trying to eliminate uncertainty by being certain himself. When we speak with certainty where God hasn't spoken, based on our own assumptions, we risk more than just being wrong. It's more than just being off or wrong or making a mistake. We risk misrepresenting the character of God. And that's a big deal. That's not a small thing. There are things we know about God, and there are things we don't know about him, um, and what he's doing and why he's doing it. The more certain we think we are about what God is doing, the more careful we should be. The more certain we think we are, the more careful we should be. And if God hasn't said it clearly, we shouldn't say it confidently. And you really shouldn't say, oh, God says this or that. And sometimes, again, that's an assumption. But the more certain we are, the more careful we should be. Because if God hasn't said it very clearly, we shouldn't say it confidently. And God doesn't tell us what he is doing in the lives of people around us. He doesn't always tell us what he's doing in our life. And when someone is suffering, they don't need our certainty. They need our compassion. They need our presence. We shouldn't assume we know what God is doing, when he's doing it, how or why he's doing it. Eliphaz speaks from experience, thinks he knows what he's talking about. Bildad speaks from tradition, thinks he knows what he's talking about. Zophar definitely thinks he knows what he's talking about. He speaks with certainty. And they say some things that sound right. And some of the things they say are right. They say different things, but they all speak from false assumptions about what God is doing, why he's doing it. And in doing so, they are doing more than just making assumptions about Job. They're misrepresenting who God is. And we've all sounded like at least one of these guys at some point, not because we don't care, but because we didn't know how to be at peace with suffering and uncertainty. We couldn't just sit in silence. We had to take control or push someone through suffering, whatever it might be. And after all the explanations from these guys of what God is doing and why Job is suffering, it's then that God speaks. And you can be certain of what he says. In Job chapter 42, God says to Eliphaz and Job's other friends, he says, "You've not spoken of me what is right." And you know how it feels when somebody misrepresents you? They say something to someone else that just is not true. Nobody likes that. We all hate it when someone does that. And God tells Eliphaz how he feels about it in Job chapter 42, verse 7. He says, "My wrath is kindled against you and against your two friends, for you've not spoken of me what is right." And his wrath is kindled by their misrepresentation of who he is, because they hadn't spoken of him what is right. And he says, you haven't spoken of me what is right, like my servant Job. So God contrasts Job with his friends, not because Job understood everything, knew why things were happening, but because he was honest and didn't misrepresent God. Job 42:8 says, and this is God speaking to Job's friends. He says, and now take for yourselves 7 bulls, 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, offer up for yourselves a burnt offering, and my servant Job will pray for you. For him I will accept, lest I deal with you according to your folly, in that you have not spoken of me the thing which is right, like my servant Job. And that would be humbling. God says, Job is going to intercede for you with me. He's going to pray for you. And I will accept his prayers instead of dealing with you according to your foolishness, your foolish misrepresentation of who I am. So God takes being misrepresented seriously. So we want to be careful of that. Just like we often do, Job's friends intended to be helpful, but they made false assumptions about God, and that matters. That's not a small thing. Wrong assumptions form the words we say, and they can wound people. But even more importantly, when we do that, we misrepresent who God is. Here's a weighty topic to consider that I think about a lot for obvious reasons. When we speak about God, especially to someone who's suffering, we're not just sharing opinions. We are representing who God is. It's like being an ambassador for him. That's a bad time to make assumptions. We don't want to end up in a situation like Job's friends. Sometimes people say, well, I'm just going to say what needs to be said. And if someone doesn't like it, too bad. And that's what Zophar thought too. I'm going to give you something that I think will help actually support someone who is suffering and avoid bad theology. And the great thing about it is it's not hard, and you don't have to know a bunch of theology. All you need to know is that God is highest, he is trustworthy, he is greatest. So when you are with someone who's suffering, first start by just being present. Set your assumptions aside. All you need to say is, I'm here for you, however you need me, and mean it. And let that sit. Just let it sit. Sometimes suffering is sacred. We don't want to oversimplify it with something mundane. God uses suffering to form people. And it may not be comfortable to do that, but that's something we need to learn to do, is to just sit and be silent. Yeah, it's not going to be comfortable. But don't explain why something's happening or tell someone what they need to do or give them unsolicited advice. Excuse me. Got the cough going. Been talking too much. We give people unsolicited advice. They probably already know anyway. I mean, sometimes people do know why they're suffering, and they may already know anyway. And if they don't, anything we say is likely just an assumption. But instead of explaining, listen with curiosity. Listen with curiosity. God's given us one mouth, 2 ears. We should listen at least twice as much as we speak. And curiosity is showing interest and care for someone. And that means not cutting them off, avoid talking over them or interjecting. Just sit and listen. Pay attention. Lean in. Nod your head. Attend. And if they pause, well, they're talking. Learn to be comfortable with silence. Make room for silence. Just let it sit. Let them process. Let them think. The goal isn't silence. It's faithfulness. And you don't have to be afraid to speak. This isn't about that. I know I talk a lot about silence, but this isn't about not speaking at all. But instead of giving advice or assuming you know or understand what someone's going through, what their situation is, ask curious questions instead. And if you know what the answer to your question is going to be or what you want the answer to be, that's not a curious question. Not questions that are leading or correcting or pointing out what you think is wrong. Don't make light of things by making statements or asking questions that imply it's not a big deal. Even if it isn't, to them it's probably a big deal. Personally, I think humor is a terrible way to deal with someone's suffering. I think it's rude. Uh, that might be culturally just me, though. But curious questions lead to learning and understanding. A curious question might sound something like, I want to understand and make sure I'm hearing you correctly. And this is what I think I hear. And then repeat what they've said and ask, does that sound right? Does it sound like I understand you correctly? And listen, ask, and learn. And if you do that, if you're willing to do that, make the effort, get comfortable, be curious, ask questions, learn about what a person is going through. If you're willing to do that, not only will you be unlike anyone else they've spoken to, but you'll also begin to understand and build trust. And that's building a relationship, and it's not misrepresenting God and who He is. And when someone trusts you, and you build that trust, they might actually open up and tell you about what's going on. They might feel like, okay, I can be comfortable with this person and I can actually share what's happening. And if they really trust you, they might even ask you, what do you think about this? What do you think I should do? But even then, be careful about giving advice, because if they follow it and it's wrong or goes bad, that's on you. So be careful about giving people advice. But if you aren't willing to put in the effort of supporting someone and, building that trust and relationship with them, it's hard to convince someone that you're someone worth listening to. It really is. And like I said, I've emphasized silence a lot because we tend to speak first and listen later if we listen at all. But this isn't about silence. I mean, sometimes people need advice. There are times when people need correction because they just don't see what someone else sees. But unless you're willing to build the kind of relationship with someone that allows that, or willing to be the kind of person people feel like they can come to when they are suffering, anything you say is probably going to fall on deaf ears. And you probably shouldn't bother saying it anyway. But what would it look like if you were to make room in a way that people felt like they could share struggles with you and ask for your help? You're that person they say, oh, I can trust this person. I'm going to go to them and talk to them about this. And that's a good way to parent your kids too. But here's how you can work that out this week in your own life. Grow, live, go. Um, Grow. Examine your assumptions about God and other people. Think about that. Where am I making assumptions? Where am I making assumptions about God? Where am I making assumptions about other people? In this time or this week, take time to reflect on that, to think about it, pray about it. Where do I tend to assume instead of ask? And then ask God to show those assumptions to you, and then take them to God and let it scripture, not experience or tradition or certainty, shape what you believe about Him. Ask Him to grow you in humility, which is often a difficult thing because gaining humility, I think, often involves suffering. But ask Him to grow you in humility so you become someone who seeks understanding before forming conclusions, and you become someone who people trust, someone who reflects Jesus. And then live. Practice listening with humility. Practice listening with humility. When someone shares something difficult, or even, well, anything, you can always practice listening with humility. It doesn't even have to be difficult. But resist the urge to explain, to fix, to one up someone, or give immediate advice. Stop thinking about what you're going to say next or how you're going to answer their question before they're finished. Instead, be present, attend, listen carefully, ask thoughtful questions. Slow down enough to understand before you respond. We're peaceful people. We don't rush. And that's how we can begin to reflect the character of Jesus in real everyday situations, by the way we listen to people and how we give them room to talk, and which leads us to go. Make room for someone else's suffering. Intentionally check in with someone this week. And not to correct them, not to give them advice, but just to care for them. And create space where they can be honest without fear of being judged or analyzed or misunderstood. And show them what Christ like behavior looks like. Reflect Jesus, not just by what you say, but by how you listen, how you respond, and how you stay present. When people are hurting, they don't need our assumptions. They need to see a reflection of Jesus through us. So let's work on being the kind of people who give them that. Well, I'm grateful for you taking the time to listen in today. And if you have found this helpful in some way, if you found value in it, I would certainly appreciate it if you could like, share, comment, whatever. You can buy me a coffee. There's a link in the description, and I would be very grateful for that. And I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you for listening to Walking with Conviction in an Anxious Age. As you go, remember, following Jesus isn't about having all the answers, but walking faithfully with the truth you've been given. Stay present, think clearly, walk intentionally. And wherever Jesus leads you this week, keep walking, faithful, grounded, and free.